Let me tell you about something that happened to me. Something I've never been able to explain. I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it, but the more I think about it, the more questions I have. It's not the kind of thing I'd normally share, but here we are. This happened about 5 years ago. I was living in a small town in upstate New York, working remotely as a graphic designer. It was the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and things rarely change. I'd rented a small house just outside of town. It wasn't anything fancy, one of those old 2-story places with creaky floors and windows that didn't quite seal. But it was quiet, and the rent was cheap, perfect for someone like me who prefers their own company. The first couple of months were uneventful. I settled into a routine, working during the day and spending my evenings reading or watching TV. The house had a certain charm to it. Even the creaks and groans of the old woodwork felt comforting after a while. That all changed one night in late October. It started with a sound. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint tapping noise. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the side of the house. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind or the house settling. But the sound didn't stop. I got up, grabbed my phone, and made my way downstairs. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the tapping stopped the moment I reached the bottom step. The silence was oppressive. I stood there for a while, listening, but there was nothing. Eventually, I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. The same tapping sound, around the same time. This time it was louder, more insistent. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding, and flipped on the lights. Again, the noise stopped as soon as I moved. I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked. There was no sign of anything out of place. This went on for a week. Every night, the tapping. Every night, I'd get up to investigate, only to find nothing. It was starting to get to me. I wasn't sleeping well, and during the day, I felt like I was constantly on edge. Something about the sound felt intentional, like someone was trying to get my attention. Then the messages started. I woke up one morning to find a note slipped under my front door. It was written on a piece of yellowed paper, the kind you'd find in an old notebook. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, like it had been scrawled in a hurry. The note said, "Do you hear it too?" My first thought was that it was some kind of prank, maybe one of the neighborhood kids messing with the new guy in town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The tapping had already put me on edge, and now this? It felt too coincidental. Didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part of me felt like I needed answers. That night I stayed up late, sitting in the dark with the lights off, waiting for the sound to start. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., the tapping began. This time it was coming from the living room. I tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. When I reached the bottom step, I froze. The sound was coming from the window, but there was no one there. Just darkness beyond the glass. And then I saw it. In the faint moonlight, I could make out a handprint on the outside of the window. It was smudged, like someone had pressed their palm against the glass and dragged it downward. My stomach dropped. I rushed to the door, threw it open, and stepped outside, my breath clouding in the cold night air. But the yard was empty. No footprints in the frost-covered grass. No sign that anyone had been there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to call the police. I explained everything. The tapping, the note, the handprint. They sent an officer to take a look, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. The officer suggested it might be animals or even a neighbor playing a prank. I didn't believe him, but I didn't argue. What could I say? The next few nights were quiet, no tapping, no notes. I started to think maybe it was over, whatever it was. Then, one morning, I found another note. This one was taped to the inside of my bedroom window. "You shouldn't have called them. I felt sick. Someone had been inside the house while I was sleeping. I decided to stay at a hotel for a while. I packed a bag and left that afternoon, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get out of there. The hotel was a cheap place off the highway, but it felt like a fortress compared to my house. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and left the TV on for background noise. That night, for the first time in weeks, I fell asleep quickly. But it didn't last. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of tapping. It was coming from the hotel room door. My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, staring at the door. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I whispered to the operator, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. I stayed on the line until the police arrived. They checked the hallway and the security footage, but found nothing. No one had been near my door all night. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I called my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't care about losing my deposit. I just wanted to be done with that house, with that town. I moved back to the city, into a crowded apartment building where the noise of neighbors was a constant comfort. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. I started sleeping better, and the memory of the tapping began to fade. One morning, I woke up to the tapping starting over. But then, a few weeks ago, I found something that brought it all rushing back. I was unpacking a box of old books when I found a piece of yellowed paper tucked inside one of them. It was a note, written in that same jagged handwriting. It said, "You can't run forever." I've been hearing tapping at night again, and now, I don't know if it's better to stay and face whatever this is, or to run again. Because what scares me the most is the thought that it doesn't matter where I go, it will always find me.